I'm Anna McKie, and in this video we're going to look at range and the interquartile range, also known as IQR. We're not doing box plots in this one, so join me in the next video for that. So, measures of spread, what are they? As we've got written here, so to more completely describe a data set, we need to discuss the spread of data as well as the centre. So we've done some videos on measuring the centre, the mean, median and mode if you like, but we like to know how that data is spread out. Now these measures of spread, they tell us whether the data values are similar or different. So some of the words that we often use are consistent or consistency, if they're all grouped near each other and similar, or if they're really spread out, they might be different to each other. So to have a visual representation, having a look at this diagram here, these graphs. Now, what can you notice about each of them before we even read what's written there? Curve A, look how high up that goes, and look how far across it goes to the left and the right of that dashed line, which is the mean, which is the middle. What about B and C? How spread out are they in comparison to that mean in the middle there? And what about how high up they go? And what might the height tell us in terms of the frequency? Because they're all bunched around the middle there, how often they're happening. But then the more spread out they go, the lower that peak becomes because there's less data around there. So I guess often there's frequency along what would be the vertical axis. So let's have a read what we've got written. So curve A we're saying is the most consistent. It has a narrow distribution curve. As we said, its data is all bunched up. This shape of these, you might have seen them before. We often call them a bell curve or a normal distribution curve. And they can be for tall, narrow things like that, or wide, spread out things like more like B and C. C, we would say, is the most inconsistent or the least consistent, because the range there, look at how far it goes on the left and to the right. Really spread out data values there, whatever they might be. It could be heights or weights or those sorts of things. So the range, and we calculate that by the maximum value subtract the minimum value. So what was sort of the highest height of someone, subtract the lowest height, and that will give us a range. Probably should have just skipped ahead to the slide there because it sort of sums it up for me there. Now quartiles. That word quartiles, does it sound a bit similar to any other word you've heard before? Perhaps quarter? So the quartiles, they show us the position of the data. So in terms of if we're breaking it into quarters, so to speak. So there's 4 quarters in a whole. The median is the middle data value, which we've talked about before. That's if you have them all in order and you find the one that's positioned in the middle. That splits the data into 2 halves. And then the quartiles divide them into quarters. So we have endpoints at the beginning of the end of each quarter, so to help us sort of navigate how far along the data we are. Here's a bit of a visual representation if you like. So using this box to represent all of the different data values. I'm just going to keep referring to heights. Let's say in your high school, we measured the heights of all the year 11 students and we wrote down all of those numbers. So we could list the minimum and the maximum value there as the minimum and the maximum height. And we would use those to work out the range. And the median is if you lined everybody up or lined up all of those data values from lowest to highest, the one that sits in the middle has half of the data below it and half above. Now, breaking it into quarters, we talk about Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 sometimes, but Q1 and 3 are the most common, and let me sort of try and explain why. So if each quarter has a beginning and an end, yes, you could technically call the minimum Q0 if you like. 0 or 0 or O is sometimes for the original or the first one. End of the first quarter is Q1. End of the second quarter, we could call that Q2, but we tend to call it the median because that implies an average and the middle. End of the third quarter, Q3. End of the fourth quarter, we could call it Q4, but the word that we're more used to using is the maximum value. And again, a quarter of each of the data is in each section. It's not necessarily the range within them might not be the same. That might not make much sense until we do an actual example. Okay, now the interquartile range. Try and think about those words. Range, we've talked about. That's when you sort of take a minimum and a maximum value of something. Quartile, quarters, and inter, between or within, that sort of prefix there. So we're talking about the range within the quarters that are in the middle. So being this video is pitched mainly to year 11s here and using your graphics calculators. Could also be helpful for year 10s or anybody using a graphics calculator. So we'll assume that you can enter your data into your calculator there. So the Q1 and the Q3 numbers that will appear on your screen, that's what we're interested in to create the IQR, the interquartile range. A little note here, again, thinking about heights, they can be really distorted by minimum and maximum values, or almost outliers if you like, because you might have a significantly short person and a significantly tall person, and they don't give a good indication of what's happening around the middle of the data, the 50% of the data that's in the middle. Whereas the IQR does give a great indication of what's happening in those middle two quarters. And so that's often why we use the IQR to discuss the spread of data. So this is for ungrouped data here. Just a little side note, that you will need to order that, but your calculator does that for you, so you don't have to go to all that effort. In the Casio calculator, menu 2, stat menu there. We've used this example before, talking about the number of faulty products returned to an electrical goods store over 21 days. So you may still already have your data in your list there. If you may have to delete the 22nd one so that your numbers match here, putting them in list 1, making sure they're correct. So it's 21 days. Remember to check that it lines up with the number 21. And then where do we find the summary statistics, so to speak? So in your calculators, F2 lines up with calculate, and then we need to set it F6, and you need to check that your values match this. We're interested in list 1 and the frequency of 1 as we see here. And so that's just saying we just want one of each value. We don't want multiples of any of them. And then the summary statistics, you would exit out of that screen, and then you would choose one var, one variable statistics, which is F1. This screen here, you'll only see sort of the top portion on your screen, and then you'll need to arrow down so that you can get to what's this called is our 5-number summary. And so then you'll get your minimum, maximum, Q1, Q3, and your median that was there as well. And so how do you calculate the range? It's the maximum number, take the minimum number, which you would have got from that 5-number summary. And the interquartile range there is Q3 subtract Q1. It was 8, take 3 to give us 5. And the values are there. Perhaps should have put that one on earlier. It's often quite handy to write that down so you don't have to keep going back to your screen to work out where all the numbers come from. For group data, there is a similar process to get to these, but you may have to adjust some of the settings as noticed here in list 2. We're not going to go into detail about that yet, but it's just something to be aware of. If you've got a table and the data is grouped, so it's got a range, so you might have, the number of people between 120 to 130 centimetres tall, we had 7. And so in that sense, you have to work things out in a slightly different way. So just be prepared for that, but we're not going to go into that in this video. Okay, but then once you have calculated the statistics, working out the range and the IQR will be the same from that list of summary statistics. Okay, they're the questions that this correlates to. Join me for the next video on box plots.